in today's video, I'm going to talk to you about two really good index funds that you can look at for the year 2025, considering Indian investment. Now, so a couple of questions before we actually enter the index fund video is Shashank, why choose an index fund and why not choose a large cap fund? So there is a possibility that you can choose large cap fund and get better returns. But if you look at the history and if you look at the past, most of the large cap funds have not able to beat the index funds over a long period of time. So there are definitely a couple of reasons why someone would choose an index fund over a large cap fund, because most of the companies inside the large cap and the index fund are pretty much the same. So what are the 5 reasons why I would choose an index fund over a large cap fund? Number one is lower expense ratios. Now, expense ratio is basically what the mutual fund charges you for managing your entire money over a period of time. Now, if you look at index funds, they usually charge you anywhere between 0.1 to 0.3% a year as their fees, because it is a passively managed fund. Now, whereas if you look at an actively managed fund, like a large cap fund, where there is a fund manager sitting with a team of analysts buying, selling, they will usually charge anywhere between 1 to 2% as an expense ratio. Now, that is huge considering the fact that most of the funds don't beat the index and they charge you a higher expense ratio. So that is why the disconnect happens. Now, talking about market returns. Now, obviously, the benchmark index will have the best market returns because that is the Nifty 50 going all across compared to large cap, right? So, large cap, what happens is they might include some companies that might do well and outperform the index, or they might hold companies that might not outperform the index. But over a period of time, almost 80 to 90% of the large cap mutual funds have not even beat the benchmark index. So you have to either perform and invest in the top 10 best large cap companies that have actually beat the index over a long period of time, or else if you don't want that tension and you're like, Shashank, I'm going to invest for more than 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and I don't care about what happens, then it is easier to just put in an index fund, because you know that there is not going to be much outperformance that happens with this. Now, if you want to see a very nice image of this, let me show you large cap mutual fund underperforming the bench cap return in the last 5 years. So if you look at Axis Blue Chip Fund, which is one of the biggest large cap funds out there, they have underperformed the benchmark return. If you look at DSP Top 100, Bandhan, Franklin, Grow, HSBC, so many big companies, even UTI, have actually underperformed the fund. Now, there are companies that have outperformed the benchmark index as well by a few margin, but then the expense ratio covers it up. So the difference may not be so great, is what I'm trying to tell you. Now, the third very important reason why someone would invest in an index fund is because you have reduced management risk. Now, what is management risk? If you look at a large cap fund, there is a fund manager. Tomorrow, what happens if the fund manager leaves, takes bad calls, right? They have a structural change in their management and something goes wrong and they're not able to do a good job that you thought they would do, but they will still continue charging the same expense ratio. So in a passive fund like an index fund, there is no manager, right? A manager just has to just track the index and just copy the index and just continue copying that index. There is no brain that has to be applied a lot into this, right? Whenever the index changes, he has to change the allocation of his things in the mutual fund as well. So the management risk is reduced drastically when it comes to index funds as compared to large cap funds. Now let's quickly look at two index funds that you can look at from a long term period. Now, before we get into index fund, there is one problem that everyone has to understand, and that is something called tracking error. Now, if you look at what the meaning of tracking error is, all index funds have something known as a tracking error. And you can see that tracking error can be described as a risk of an investment portfolio compared to its benchmark, because it measures the performance of a particular investment and compare it to the performance against the benchmark. So what happens is sometimes the index composition changes, right? For example, tomorrow Adani would go out, maybe some other company would come into the index. That means all index funds should also remove the same amount of Adani, sell it, and then buy the new company as well. Now, when that happens, you know it is not instant. There is a time gap, there is a price gap, there is a tracking error that happens, right? So Nifty will adjust like this, but by the time this fund manager has gone in, sold Adani shares, bought the next company, there will be a difference, and that is called as a tracking error. Now, lower the tracking error, that means the fund manager is good. Higher the tracking error means they're not fast enough to adapt to change. Now, let's look at some of the quick index funds that are there in the market that is providing low expense ratio. Now, the first fund we will look at is called ICICI Prudential Nifty 50 Index Fund. Now, please understand, none of the funds that I'm showing you today, both the funds, I am not associated with them. I don't do branding for them, and this is not a sponsored video. This is purely out of my intention, and this is only for educational purposes. Please look at it from an educational standpoint, right? This is just from a learning perspective. The first fund is ICICI Prudential Nifty 50 Index Fund. Now, don't have to look at the returns because the returns are equal to what Nifty has given. So if you look at 1 year returns, it is 22, and if you look at 5 year returns, it's around 15% CAGR, which is not bad considering the fact that the bull run has also pushed this to 15% CAGR, or else it would be around 12 to 13%. The AUM of this fund is around 11,500 crores, and the expense ratio. Remember, the expense ratio is what? It is basically what the fund charges you, and that is currently at 0.17, means it is very low, right? 0.17. So please understand, this is also a direct growth plan. So please always choose a direct growth plan. If you choose a regular plan, then the expense ratio goes to 0.35, and whoever has sold you that mutual fund will take some nice commission from you as well, and you lose out on the compounding advantage. 0.35 is a big amount, right? So ICICI Prudential is one of the good ETFs that are there currently out there, or index funds that are there out there. But if we look at the tracking error, because tracking error is very important, we can go check the tracking error of this company, ICICI Nifty 50 plan. Let's go down, and I'm just checking the tracking error over here. Tracking error is 0.13%, right? Which is considered to be very low in the market, because you'll never have 0% tracking error. There will always be some tracking error, but this is considered very low in the market. Now, the second fund that we will look at, which is currently the biggest fund with respect to index funds in India, is the UTI Nifty 50 Index Fund, right? This is sitting at a NAV of 162. Again, the CAGR would be pretty much the same, 15%. Expense ratio, as you see, is slightly higher than the ICICI one. ICICI is 0.17 to do the same job, whereas UTI is charging 0.19 to do the same job, right? That means you might say that, Shashank, maybe the tracking error is lower. That's why they're charging you 2% higher. Maybe they're more efficient. I don't know. Let's look at it. So if you look at the same thing, it is also at 0.13, right? Let me just show you to you again. This is UTI Nifty 50 Growth Option Direct, and the tracking error over here is also 0.13. So both of them have a pretty similar tracking error. So even though both of them have a pretty similar tracking error, as you see, the expense ratio of UTI is slightly more, which is 0.19, compared to ICICI, which is 0.17, right? So if you're looking at a very long-term compounding kind of a game, ICICI would slightly give you 0.02% slight higher benefit as compared to, let's say, a UTI. Now, ideally, it is always good to have at least two index funds in your portfolio, not bank everything on one, because tomorrow the tracking error might increase as well. So having two in your portfolio would be great, and I've shown you that too. Now, if you ask me for an allocation perspective, I would say that if you are investing in the market, then index funds are pretty much solid, right? But again, this is not a short term investment. This is more than 5 year plus kind of an investment perspective, right? Because you are banking and betting on the Indian economy and the Indian market. So index funds will only do well if the Indian economy and the Indian market is doing well. So having a good exposure into this is not a bad option at all. So this is something that you can definitely look at. Okay, awesome. So this was a quick video on the two index funds that are looking good for 2025 in India. If you have any doubts, any questions, do let me know. This is me, Shashank Udupa, signing off. Take care. See you guys. Bye.